Okay, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Andrew McStay. He's a reader on advertising and digital media in Bangor University in the UK, so he came all the way here. And on his website, he lists a number of research interests, for example, creativity, advertising, digital media, motivational analytics, philosophy, politics, and privacy. He doesn't list games, but he's obviously interested in those as well. He has a PhD in digital advertising, and he has authored many books and papers, for example, on privacy and philosophy and creativity in advertising. And what he's come today to talk about is kind of about emotion-sensitive technology. So computers are in general kind of these digital rational media, right, that are zeros and ones. What we expect from them that they read our emotions, that they can process it, and also evoke good emotions in us. And so how this is done and kind of things that are concerned with this, he's going to talk about, and actually in the case of games. So his talk is entitled Empathic Media, the Case of Gaming. So welcome.
Since September, I've been working on a project looking at the relationship between emotions and technology. So I've been working on a study which was co-created with the UK's data protection regulator, a major advertising agency in the UK called M&C Saatchi, who've been doing quite a bit of work on emotion and AI technologies, and Privacy International. And really what my study's about is trying to get a sense of where an emotion-sensitive technological environment, what it will look like. We're not quite here yet. Some of these things have kind of been in development, particularly in gaming, for some years. But at present, in terms of mass market consumer technologies that make use of emotion, we're not quite there yet. So I think from my personal point of view, I kind of have a few ethical qualms about some of this. So I'm interested in, A, obtaining a picture of where we're going and trying to get a sense of what it would be like to live in that place, and to think about how desirable such a place would be. But the study is also thinking about opportunities, but particularly ethical opportunities. And also, I'm interested in what people actually think about this. And as I'll go on to talk about later on in the talk, we've done a big UK survey to get a sense of what people actually think and feel about living in a media and technological environment where emotion tracking is the norm. So as Ingmar says, my background is kind of digital advertising, media, privacy, but I think gaming is especially relevant. And actually doing some preparation for this talk, you kind of really get the sense that gaming has kind of been way ahead on these topics for quite some years. So I think from my point of view as kind of as a digital media and advertising scholar, I'm actually learning a hell of a lot from the gaming environment. And possibly we can open up some conversation towards the end of the talk where perhaps I can learn a few more things as well. So yeah, my intention is to speak for around kind of half an hour, 40 minutes, and then ideally to leave kind of 15, 20 minutes for questions and discussion towards the end. But yeah, just to highlight my experience with gaming, this is Street Fighter. It's from 1987. That is me on the left, not the right. But I'm still stuck in 1987, perhaps with a smidgen of Angry Birds thrown in as well. That's about as knowledgeable as my mass gaming is. So it's a slightly weird conversation for me to give, but I think as mentioned, the experience that gaming has with kind of biometric tech is utterly invaluable for anybody who's studying this stuff. So in terms of the word empathic media, it's probably best that we start off with a definition. So in terms of what I define as empathic media, I talk about it in terms of the capacity for emergent media to sense, interpret, understand what is significant for people, act on their emotional states, and make use of their intentions and expressions. So to crystallize what that is, empathic media is interested in our emotions and our intentions. Well, I think that's kind of an interesting point, emotion and intentionality. So you could possibly see where kind of my background in advertising and marketing comes in. So but otherwise, empathic media profile emotions, both at individual, but also group level as well. So I think individual is kind of interesting from the point of view of gameplay, but group is kind of interesting from the point of view possibly kind of questions about kind of surveillance, which we'll come on to touch about. But the situation's arising for some fairly obvious reasons. When we talk about intelligence, we hear a lot, about artificial intelligence, clearly. But we kind of hear less about artificial emotional intelligence. And when we think what a rounded person actually is, they're not a person who's kind of just simply a kind of cognitive machine. But there's something else. We have an emotional life, and emotional life frames cognitive life, quite arguably. So I think it's kind of important that we kind of start to think about AI, but also artificial emotional intelligence as well. So in terms of how I got into all of this, my recent book, Privacy and Philosophy, I kind of stumbled into this. I was looking at kind of recent trends in behavioral advertising. You don't need to read all of that, perhaps just kind of flick through to the things that are tagged in blue. But I was looking at patents. Patents, I don't know if you do this, but if you're doing any kind of social science research, looking at online patents is a wonderful way of getting a sense of kind of where companies are going and what areas they're moving into without being guarded by public relations and kind of so on and so forth. But this Verizon case was particularly interesting because you could see on the slide, it was incredibly detailed in terms of what facets of life Verizon want to access. And clearly this is a wish list rather than reality. A patent is sometimes a land grab for what a company would like to do rather than what they actually can do at the moment. But it's interesting to look through kind of in terms of facial recognition, source localization in terms of where audio is coming from, gestures, mannerisms, also physical attributes as well in terms of skin color, which is arguably kind of slightly controversial, hair length, so on and so forth. But also physical surroundings in terms of what's going on within a domestic space, a domestic living room, what brands are pleasant, what objects are there, what photographs are there, and so on and so forth. But it's kind of this bit towards kind of the end here where kind of things start to get really interesting for me, because it's not just kind of about kind of traditional kind of behavioral advertising tags, but it's also about moods. And I found this kind of really particularly interesting. So I dedicated a chapter in Privacy in the Media to look at kind of moods and emotions. Yeah. So in terms of what empathy is, empathy isn't about sympathy. So in terms of kind of methodologically thinking about what empathy actually is, it's not about sympathy. Because one can empathize, we can understand what somebody else is going through, but we can still say, thank God that didn't happen to me. So we're kind of divorced. Whereas sympathy, we kind of be in alignment with a person, whereas empathy is kind of something slightly different. It's not about a special sense of feeling into the skulls of others. We don't somehow just kind of reach into the minds of others. And it's not a special sixth sense, but it's an interpretive act. And I think that's kind of a key point. In terms of what empathy is, it's an interpretive act to understand behavior, emotion, intentions, and thereafter for technologies to react appropriately. So I've got a few examples to talk through, but I thought I'd begin with one that actually spun out of MediaX, which is, this one. So I don't know how many of you are aware of a company called Spire, who are based down in San Francisco. Martha, you're quite clearly aware of them. But yeah, I talked to them on my last trip here when I was here in 2014. And again, they make mood tracking wearables. And this, again, is quite a good example of how quantitative technologies interact with qualitative life. And in terms of how it works, the unit registers different types of respirations. So essentially, it's a wearable little breathing tracker, respiration tracker, which sits on your belt, on your hip. And it kind of it registers, it works by means of kind of force sensing resistance, and then kind of converts kind of breathing exhalations and inhalations, the patterns of inhalations and exhalations, into electrical signals, which thereafter are claimed to indicate calmness, focus, tension, and activity. And I thought this was really quite an interesting one. This is a wearable I actually stuck with for a while. I don't know if we have many wearables users here, but if you're like me, you've probably got maybe one or two wearables that you wear and possibly kind of a few more on a shelf, which you wore once and kind of never seen the light of day since. But this was one I stuck with for about 6 months because it was actually quite an accurate one. But the point in being, it's that relationship between quantitative life, quantity and quality even. So probably kind of aware of sentiment analysis. But again, this is another key example, another key kind of mass popular example of emotion-sensitive media. Again, used to work out the intentions of others. And I thought in the UK we have a company called Crimson Hexagon, and they've been following members of parliament, UK members of parliament, their tweets. And what they've been able to do is kind of predict how they will vote in parliamentary votes. And this has happened on some quite important issues, such as whether to go to war in Syria, for example, being kind of a long-standing issue of whether the UK should have more involvement in Syria. And what Crimson Hexagon was able to do was accurately predict the voting patterns of MPs, which from the point of view of journalists is kind of an interesting thing to be able to do. It's quite powerful information to be able to predict an outcome of kind of both individual habits, but also collective party habits as well. So again, it's quite an interesting one. You're probably aware of this one as well, which is the social media Facebook mood contagion experiment. This was 2012. And what Facebook and researchers from Cornell University did, essentially they kind of optimized users' news feed. So some people received kind of a slightly happier looking news feed. Some people received a slightly more negative news feed, defined in terms of the valence of the words that were appeared in a user's news feed. And what they found is that over a period of time, users' posting habits changed. So if they received more positive stuff, they would post more positive stuff. If they received more negative stuff, they would post more negative stuff. And what they also did as well, they also had a control group by which they lessened the overall emotion of either positive or negative. And what they found is that kind of users' posting habits reduced overall. So from the point of view kind of advertising, marketing, again, this is quite an interesting one. But this kind of caused quite a bit of controversy. So another key players in the empathic media space are two companies. This one here, which is representative of a company called Efectivo. Essentially what you're looking at here is kind of dots on the face, and they're having kind of their emotions, or their facial expressions scanned. This one is another company called Emotion. So this one's Efectivo on the left, this one's Emotion on the right. Both US companies. These are really particularly interesting companies because I think facial recognition emotion is arguably the key growth area at the moment. Emotion, as you may be aware, have just been bought by Apple. So it's unclear where they're going to go with this, what Apple's intentions are for Emotion. But clearly, there's a lot of interest in this space. Efectivo is a company that spun out of MIT. Originally, they were kind of interested in health, but they've moved over much more towards the marketing side of things. And they're working with kind of in-house market researchers such as Millward Brown. But the principle of facial coding is an interesting one. It's something that we're going to see more of, and we'll come on to talk a little bit more about this when we talk about gaming. But essentially, the idea is to kind of identify key features on a person's face and trace those points on a person's face as they move between different expressions, such as joy, such as surprise, such as sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and contempt. This one here for Emotion is kind of quite interesting as well, because what they're doing here, essentially what you have here, this is kind of a webcam view set above a television. So essentially it's about kind of being able to kind of look at a very typical family and kind of look at kind of his reactions to a particular film, her reactions to a particular film, his reactions to a particular film, and have an overall aggregate here. So interesting developments, I think. Okay. So another key company working in the empathic media space is a company called Beyond Verbal. And essentially what they're interested in, they're less interested in what people say, but how they say it. So essentially what they do, they extract individuals and emotions and character traits in real time as people speak. So again, the idea here is to try to gain kind of more authentic insight into behavior. And there's still quite a way to go with this technology, but it is interesting stuff. We did a little study about this in the UK. So they have an app which you can download for your phone. It's called Moody's. You can download it to your iPhones or your Android phones. We kind of tested it against people who you'd expect to have a typical type of voice. So, for example, you'd expect a newsreader to be authoritative, to be in control, and to speak properly. You'd expect politicians, again, particularly kind of over election periods, to be dominant, to be assertive, and again, to be in control. So it was quite interesting to take a range of these different types of actors and use the app against it. And it did pretty well. And what we actually found is that the well-funded political parties were always on message at election time, always control, always dominance, as you see there. The parties who perhaps had less media training, there were weaknesses. There were kind of moments in kind of the overall dialogue where there was kind of signs of weakness. And I thought that was quite interesting in terms of the role that media training plays. So the beyond verbal one was actually relatively accurate. Well, that's what we found. But yeah, an interesting one. EEG is a particularly interesting one. So what you're looking at here, I visited a company in London called This Place. So they're an app developer in London. And they designed a program called Mind Reader. And essentially what that does, that allows Google Glass users to take photos using their mind. So essentially you've got your glass, you've got a little NeuroSky head unit, a little consumer level EEG tracker. And the basic principle is that you try not to concentrate. You focus on something really kind of just like literally the corner of something, exclude everything else around you, and then the augmented glass visualizes a line which goes up, it takes the photo, and then you can post it onto social media. So it was a cute little thing that the company, This Place, did in London. It got a lot of traction in the UK media in terms of kind of EEG, mind brains, being used as controller devices. Do you do much work on that, Ingmar, here in terms of EEG stuff? No, okay. Is it something? I mean, is it something you've looked at in looking at interactive media and gaming? Have you done much on EEG? Yeah. Okay, a few shaky heads, a few nods. Okay. But yeah, so this was quite interesting. So what This Place are doing now, they're working with UK's British Broadcasting Corporation, again, to develop input devices. So people with locked-in syndrome is the example that This Place using, but people who can't use their limbs and literally can only use their thoughts. To use controller devices, to log on, to use the kind of BBC interfaces. But clearly, there's kind of more interesting opportunities to use EEG as controller devices. One of the examples is this one. So this is quite a recent one. So consumer level EEG is quite arguably set to get very big. And the automobile industry are very, very interested in this. And Chinese researchers late last year from Bangor University have developed what they say is the country's first car that uses nothing but brain power to drive. And I guess kind of fuel as well, but fuel aside. But being able to kind of use and move a car around, literally just using EEG trackers, which is kind of interesting because we hear a lot about the kind of driverless cars stories, but less about kind of new modes of driving. And they've done tests with this, and it kind of, so there are kind of videos of the kind of research team driving around, literally just using EEG. So it's going to be interesting to see where this goes. But I think from my point of view, somebody has an interest in kind of questions about privacy, what actually happens with this data and information. That's maybe used to infer emotional states as the driver finds themselves in kind of different circumstances, negotiation, lane changes, crashes possibly. So these things start then to kind of have consequences for the insurance industry, for example. So I think in terms of technology is interested in emotions and intentions, EEG is going to be quite a one to watch. Yeah, so advertising has been quite a big one, certainly in terms of the study that I'm working on and the companies that I'm talking to. This emotions, technology is used to understand emotions. Advertising seems to be the big area for this. So what you're looking at here, this is London's Oxford Street. This is a bus stop. And this is a person waiting for a bus looking at an ad. And essentially what the ad does, the ad has a little Microsoft Kinect camera above the ad. And it tracks whether somebody's happy, whether somebody's neutral, or whether they're grimacing and they're unhappy. So essentially you've got three different stages there: happy, neutral, and sad, I think it is. And essentially what happens when the emotions are tracked over a period of time, the ad itself changes format. So it uses what's called an evolutionary algorithm to change the design of the ad in real time. And I think that becomes interesting when we start thinking about new modes of outdoor advertising, new modes of retail experiences, where we start to think about not just individual bus shelters, but we start to link this up with IoT, smart city environments, that kind of thing, possibly even tracking as we move between different poster sites. So again, this notion of emotional augmentation in everyday life, it's something that's increasingly beginning to happen. When I started some of this, it felt a little bit speculative. Now, all the advertising agencies that I'm talking to have a real interest in emotions and how they can put emotions to work. So we've had this in London's Oxford Street. We've also had another one as well. This is quite an interesting one. So this was over at Wimbledon. Again in the UK, Wimbledon Tennis Festival. And what a company called McStay did, essentially what they did, they hooked up Wimbledon Tennis Festival with cameras that made use of facial coding, with microphones, which was listening to not what people were saying, but how they were saying it. They were watching social media for sentiment analysis and what people were tweeting, posting, images, so on and so forth. And this was on behalf of a car maker called Jaguar. And essentially what they were doing on the Jaguar website, they were tracking the overall moods and emotions of the event itself. So as Andy Murray, he gets to the final match, but doesn't quite make it again. This is a very typical reaction for UK tennis fans, i.e. nearly, so nearly. But I think, again, it's interesting to look at the technologies at play in terms of facial coding, voice analytics, and again, sentiment. Oh, and they also hooked up a number of 20, 30 people with skin response watches as well, and heart rates. So that was more of an opt-in mechanism, whereas the voice analytics and the facial coding, that was just on site. So to move on to talk a little bit more about gaming. As mentioned, gaming, you guys seem to have a lot more experience with this stuff than I do. So the history of biofeedback in games, or biofeedback being when both player and game are affected by the actions of the other. This goes back to the 1980s. I was really quite surprised by this. So this is a picture from Wired magazine from the 1980s. And essentially what this is Atari. So Atari being one of a very old video game console. Atari tested an EEG sensor called MindLink, again in the 1980s. And this didn't actually make it out onto the mass market, partly because the games were a little bit too simplistic, and the EEG didn't actually really enhance gameplay in any notable, interesting way. So essentially it got shelved. But for me, this was really quite interesting because we're talking about cars with EEG trackers and that kind of thing. So I was like, wow, amazing. But we had it some time ago. And from the point of view of somebody who would probably like to get back into games again, but finds the controllers too difficult, the idea of EEG headwear actually sounds quite cool. So the history of biofeedback in games, also found in Japan as well. So this is one for Konami, 1997. This is I don't really pretend to fully understand this, but it's a Japanese arcade dating simulator called Sheeeit Your Heart. Do you know this one? Does anybody know this one? Can you explain it for me? You're not going to explain it. Okay. Well, again, I don't pretend to fully understand this, but essentially the game focuses on finding an avatar to date, and then you date your avatar, and then you build statistics. So the general gist of the game is that it uses a player's pulse and sweat levels to influence the outcome of the game, outcome of the date. So the basic idea is to build meaningful and affective relationships with manga characters. But again, importantly for us, these relationships were measured in terms of electrodermal responses, heart rate, blood pressure, and skin conductivity influence the result of the date. I've never played it, so again, I'd be really interested if it, have you played it, can I ask? And so Tetris as well, Nintendo were doing this. So this is in 1998. And again, they were using ear sensors. Essentially what you've got here, this is an ear sensor, which clicks onto the lobe here. Again, to monitor heart rate, which thereafter altered the game's speed. A slightly more, moving kind of more towards present day. This is from around 2005. This is academic work. It's Skipbone, an early interactive scenario involving a gameplay and an empathic avatar. So this avatar here, which is this guy here, he's called Max. And essentially what Max does, he responds to the emotional and physical state of the player. So this is around the mid-2000s. Again, this is, this is academic stuff done by Becker et al. 2005 in Europe. But so it wasn't mass market, but what was really quite interesting about this is that A, it was bi-directional. It discerned a wide range of emotions in real time. It responded to people's emotional states and thereafter learned, and the learning part is clearly quite key, how to modulate emotions in people by means of that data collected. So for example, Max, if he kind of thought he was about to lose, he would express fear. If he was doing well, he would express surprise and happiness. And the expression occurred not just kind of literally by smiles, but also grunts, modulation of breathing, and utterances in terms of kind of words and kind of things that he might say, or even just kind of, grunts. So Max was able to both read and adjust to opponents' emotional states. So this was kind of some of the early stuff in Europe. Some of the more interesting, kind of moving towards kind of mid-2000 up to 2010, Valve did a lot of work in this area. So do most of you know who Valve are? Yeah, so Valve, clearly kind of a big gaming company. And I talked to Mike from Valve. He's kind of one of the senior people there. And he was really quite interesting. He kind of cited these three games that, for him, kind of really represented what Valve were up to in the kind of mid to late 2000s. So Valve Left 4 Dead, for example, again measured skin responses. And those skin responses, in terms of kind of the arousal rates inferred by their skin responses, featured into kind of visual effects within the game in terms of music, whether it kind of goes up or whether it goes down, whether it speeds up, whether it slows down, character communication and game features such as kind of types of weapons that you might want to find within the game. In Alien Swarm, players had to maintain calm against a ticking clock. So again, this was done by means of skin conductivity, and this essentially created a feedback loop where if players became less calm, you start getting a bit nervy as the kind of game's kind of moving on, the clock actually speeds up, thereafter creating more anxiety in the player, which thereafter speeds up the clock again. So you have that kind of feedback loop. The consequence of that is that skin wasn't just used as a peripheral device to register sentiment, feeling, and emotions, but it actually steered the nature and direction of gameplay. It was interesting having this conversation with Mike because although Valve kind of innovated in this area, in gaming and biofeedback, their interest slowed. So when it kind of got towards the end of kind of up towards 2010, they started to do less of this. And Valve, they were a little bit unclear about this, but essentially said that there are other areas to be more productively developed. So I don't know if it was something to do with the reliability of the tracking devices, whether the tech was actually quite expensive. But I think talking with other games companies as well, kind of reliability has been the issue, but the tech is getting better. So from your point of view as kind of developers in this area, yeah, it's kind of interesting stuff to look at. So today, we've talked about kind of Valve. Valve clearly is kind of one kind of more for the hardcore gamers, but as we're all aware, most of the games played are on iPads, they're on phones, they're on kind of consumer level kind of handsets. So companies such as Efectivo are again kind of moving into this area. So Efectivo historically have been more interested in marketing, working on with kind of companies such as Millward Brown to see what people think about ads. So essentially you have a lab, you kind of hook people up, and you kind of get to register what their facial responses are as they watch an ad. And you change the ad. If there's bits like the ad that aren't working, you take it out and you kind of optimize the ad on the basis of people's reactions. But Efectivo have recently announced that they're moving into gaming. And I find this really quite interesting because this is a significant move. And again, worth remembering in mind that Emotion as well have just been bought by Apple. So the facial coding thing is moving kind of from the fringes towards center stage. I think, the idea of kind of camera-enabled facial coding of emotions is kind of an interesting one. It will really kind of enhance gameplay through handheld devices. And Efectivo, they've cottoned onto the idea that kind of extra hardware, so things such as kind of eye trackers on top of PCs, Kinect and so on and so forth, this kind of limits the experience, and particularly for kind of the mass market, who make up the main bulk of gamers. So rather than increasing layers of mediation in terms of asking us to wear more tech and having kind of more tech on top of our computers, they're just trying to use the kind of things that are already on our devices, particularly, of course, our webcams that are on our phones and our tablets. And again, this is kind of done, the simplicity of this for the user is particularly notable. But the reason is kind of why. So Efectivo said, well, we're not going to be kind of showing ads, we're not going to be showing marketing within games. That's not the idea. But certainly in terms of use of that data to improve the learning of the machines, that clearly is quite an end goal there. So although it won't be kind of a direct connection to marketing and advertising, what you see is kind of an overall interest in learning more about emotional responses, i.e. basically making the tech better, making the algorithms function more usefully. So for me, this kind of starts to lead to some questions about privacy. And Mike from Valve, he was quite interested. He was really quite forthright on this, really quite passionate about privacy. From his point of view, in terms of what happens with data about emotions, he wants to do right by Valve's users. He wants only explicit opt-in by players, so no chance whatsoever of kind of weird consent mechanisms, terms and conditions that nobody reads, and so on. So it's only used to improve user experiences. And basically, if you're going to use biometric data, it's about enhancing gameplay. So clearly Valve have a real commitment to their user base. But again, it kind of remains to be seen kind of what other companies do with this data. I think, again, as I talked to a few other companies, Valve are kind of the leading company in this area, but they were all kind of really quite pro-privacy and kind of pro their user base. They just didn't want to damage that relationship. You could argue, these are still kind of companies and corporations. We have to take these things with a pinch of salt. But I certainly got the sense that, yeah, they were quite sincere about this. But the view from the wider media industry, who are interested in emotional data, is a little bit different. So the advertising and media giants, they're telling me something quite different. And essentially, they want to use all of the data. So the direction of travel for advertising is to move to what is called programmatic advertising. Essentially, what that means is you're used to web advertising and kind of little cookies on your computer that kind of trace your interests and make inferences about kind of things that you might want to buy. Programmatic makes use of a much wider data set, say in terms of kind of information from banking details, in terms of transaction details, in terms of sentiment analysis through social media, and behavioral ad cookies, but also first-party data as well. First-party data being the data that you have with a given website. So for example, if you log onto the Guardian website and you sign in, then the Guardian will have quite a great deal of information about you and your history with that website. That's added to the programmatic mix. So in terms of the types of data tracking that takes place within advertising, it's already quite rich. But what advertisers want to do now, and the big media companies in the advertising space, they want to add emotion stuff. And a lot of that will come from gaming, because it seems to be that with gaming being such a pronounced mass medium, the data is going to be extraordinarily valuable. As it stands, the advertising agencies, the advertising companies are still trying to work out what to do with this. They know what they want to do. They know where the general media trends are, which is towards artificial emotion intelligence, towards high levels of biometric data in our media environment, but they're just not quite sure how to operationalize it. So it's been interesting talking to ad agencies. Some kind of have some expertise in neuroscience and behavior change and all the nudging literature and so on and so forth. Others have slightly more tech expertise. So if they could all get together, they would actually know what to do, but talking to them separately, and of course they're all in competition, so they're not sharing their secrets. None of them actually quite cracked this yet. But over the next year or two, the people that I've talked to, the chief science officers I've been talking to, this is the one to crack for them: how to make use of emotional data in advertising campaigns. Okay. So I conducted a survey in the UK about this, and I asked. I asked a range of questions, some to do with advertising, some to do with mobile phones and a few other things. But I also asked a question about gaming as well. So this was a 2,000-person survey within the UK across a full demographic spread and all age groups. So essentially, it was what I hope is quite a reliable survey, as far as surveys can be reliable. But that was the questions anyhow. So I asked, electronic games companies are beginning to make use of cameras and wearable tech to track players' eyes, heart rates, and respiration as they play games. They do this to heighten players' involvement and entertainment levels. Which of the following best represents your feelings about this? So hopefully, although I've mentioned privacy and surveillance a few times, and perhaps I come across a bit down that line, the question itself doesn't appear too leading. So the responses they were offered were these. 1, I am not okay with my data about me being collected in this way. 2nd, I am okay with this data collection about my emotions in this way, as long as the information is anonymized, cannot be associated with me, my email address, phone number, or other personal means of identifying me. 3, I'm okay with data collection about my emotional state, and I'm happy to be linked with personal information held about me. 4, don't know, don't understand. Now, what I'd like to know from you, which of these represents your own feelings? So I'm going to ask for a show of hands in a moment. So just take a moment to think about the question, which of these best represents your own views? So is it number 1? That you are not, I am not okay with data being collected in this way. Okay, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Vian, can you make a note of that? That's 4. Okay, so number 2, I'm okay with data about emotions collected as long as it's anonymized and can't be associated. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Number 3, are you totally open and transparent? You're okay with data collection about emotions, and you're okay for it to be linked with personal information. 1, 2. Anybody don't know? Okay, so everyone's expressed an opinion. So that's quite interesting. So in terms of what people actually told me, I think this is slightly different from what we found among the lay UK citizenry, the lay UK public. So UK, 47% said no. They thought, no, wait, presumably, I'm inferring here, because this is a quantitative survey, they found it a little bit too spooky. So no, don't want it at all. But number 2 was high, and number 2 here was by far the highest here in terms of, as long as it's not collected with personal information, it's okay. And again, the last one about being totally open in terms of don't mind either way. Yeah, that was kind of not so high either. So to conclude then, how am I doing for time? Try and wrap that up quite quickly. So yeah, in terms of what empathic media are, it's the capacity for media technologies to sense, gauge what's significant for people, act on their emotional states, and make use of intentions and expressions. We're seeing this in a massive range of domains of practice. I've only talked about some of the more screen-based stuff, but we're kind of finding this type of technology used in interviewing situations. So when you go for jobs at banks, for example, in positions where are quite sensitive, the technologies are being used there to assess authenticity in a somewhat kind of polygraph-like fashion. Policing, Motorola, for example, they're doing a lot of work on kind of emotionally surveying their own police officers to understand how they're reacting. So if there's kind of a dangerous situation that the police person has to enter into, what are they doing? Are they kind of has anxiety kind of tipped into doing something really dangerous, or is it are they able to kind of monitor and keep their emotions in check as they enter stressful situations? Surveillance, also kind of other implications there in terms of building emotional heat maps of different districts and all the screen-based stuff that we've talked about. But yeah, biofeedback in gaming from the 80s onwards. This would be, preparing for the talk, some of the examples that I came across, I was really surprised that how early, so particularly kind of the Atari work in the 1980s, using EEG trackers then as gaming input devices. People are getting really excited about this stuff now, so perhaps we all need a bit more of a history lesson on that one. But gaming, for me, is particularly interesting because your community has got so much more experience of this than myself. But yeah, today this data is of real interest to advertisers. And again, when we think about advertising, advertising isn't just a practice on its own, but it's a practice that clearly underpins our media environment, whether it be kind of online media, search, social media, and so on and so forth. But increasingly, we're kind of seeing kind of the digital spill out into the public spaces in terms of electronic billboards, in terms of kind of retail environments that are more emotion sensitive. The text there is it's just stuff that's going to filter through in the next 2-3 years. And I think the key thing to understand that the primacy of emotions in shaping decision making, that's the pull, that's the attraction for advertisers. The use, if you can understand emotions, you can sway decision making. That's the angle for them. The people themselves, though, overall, so across all the questions that I asked the UK citizenry, they don't like this. They're not keen on the tech at all. Perhaps it's a case of socialization and kind of people just need to get used to some of this stuff. So it's something that I'm going to be doing year on year, or perhaps once every 2 years. But keep the survey running because I think it should be quite interesting. And will they have a say? That's a really kind of difficult question because at present we know kind of terms and conditions that it's a flawed system. Consent mechanisms don't work. We've got a big problem here. There's a lot of scope for innovation in this space, but we kind of haven't got to the answer yet. Particularly, I think one of the things that's really quite interesting for me is with the outdoor advertising stuff, it doesn't actually collect any personally identifiable data. So essentially, it doesn't actually single out a person in any way, shape, or form. So what you have is kind of advertisers being able to make use of emotional life. They're able to survey emotional life in the aggregate. So no data held by the company can be traced back to an individual. For me, we've got a bit of a legal problem, certainly in Europe, because that's not the way our data protection regulations are meant to work. They weren't imagined for that. But in Europe, we've just had what's called the General Data Protection Regulations, which is the new regulatory tool for Europe. It makes no mention of this stuff. So already, something that's not even here is out of date. I'm possibly interested to talk about some of this stuff in the US in regard to US legislation. Yeah, and again, it matters. Emotions orient decision making. Emotions say a great deal about us. that's me done. Thank you very much.